Okay, so thanks everybody. Over to Kwajo Tweneboa, and I think you have to get this quite close.
Oh, for it to, is that all right? Yeah? Thank you. It's really, really good to be here today with you all. So my name is Kwajo Tweneboa, and for anyone that doesn't know of my work, I'm a housing campaigner and has been for the last, nearly 3 years now. Time really has flown. And my sort of backstory is I grew up in social housing. I'm from South London, Mitcham, and my mum, from the moment I was born, lived in social housing. And there was also times at which me and my family were homeless growing up. And a lot of the social housing we had lived in at the time was of really, really poor quality. And that's why I campaign against it now and have done for the last 3 years. So in around 2016 time, we were homeless and we was moved into temporary accommodation, and our options were to either move to Luton, and I'm from London, and I was studying my A-levels final year at the time. My sister was studying for her GCSEs. She had her exams that same year. So the options were either move to Luton from Mitcham, South London, and give up everything basically, or take the only temporary accommodation which was on offer. And that's exactly obviously what my dad did at the time, but it happened to be a converted car garage. So it still had the garage door on. It was really, really poorly converted, and we had issues like damp and mold going on to furniture and the beds and the walls. And we had like ant infestations. We had a bathroom that was the size of like a cupboard. Like really, really tiny, and we were there. There was nothing temporary about it because we was in there for well over a year before we moved in, or we was offered permanent social housing, and that too was in terrible conditions when my dad accepted, and it was after years battling to get social housing, so he did accept, and he was very grateful at the time. But the property we moved into had issues like damp and mold, cockroaches, mice. We had lights that were filled with water, a bathroom which wasn't fit for use, and a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old and infested with woodlice. And we accepted that property, but had been complaining about the conditions that it was in, like a lot of tenants I've learned. But nothing was ever done, and he was diagnosed with cancer, stage 1 esophageal cancer, after about a year of us being there, and that progressed to stage 4 in the space of a year. And he went from walking around to then being fed through his stomach and bedbound because of a tumour in his like throat area, and he couldn't eat. And he was receiving medical treatment 3 times a day amongst those conditions: the cockroaches, the mice, the damp, the mold. They could barely bathe him in the bathroom that we had, lights filled with water, like I mentioned. And he passed away in January 2020. And things sort of went from bad to worse, because on the day of his funeral, which was February 2020, we had a massive leak and a ceiling caved in, and we had been complaining about it, but no one came out to look at it until October of that same year. So about 8 months later, and then they pulled the ceiling down and didn't tell us it contained asbestos, and there was dust left everywhere. And we thought, okay, it might be a week or 2 before another ceiling's put back up, but it wasn't until January the following year that a ceiling was put back up, so it was just beams in our living room. It wasn't a living room, it was described as not even fit for animals to live in. And at the time I had enough. We had been complaining about all the other issues, and they wouldn't come and deal with it, so I decided to do the only thing I could at the time and could think of, and that was to take pictures of the inside of my home, embarrassingly, go to social media, post it on there, and hope that we would get the response we did. And I couldn't have expected the response that I did receive. I mean, I was expecting abuse or blame, because that's what you assume, and that's what a lot of tenants assume, and is the reason why they don't really want to speak up about these sorts of issues. But the national news picked it up. I then went around my whole estate and knocked on every single door, went in their homes. And there were situations where people had been living with disrepair for longer than I've been alive. In one case, it was 27 years, and at the time I was 22 years old. And it was a lady in her 60s who was having to go to B&Q and buy cement and mix it in her kitchen to fill holes because of the mouse infestation in her property, as well as the kitchen and bathroom falling to bits, just because our landlord wouldn't come out and deal with it. I then decided after that I was going to go around the rest of London, and then it spread from there. I had people from all 4 corners of the country, even Northern Ireland, reaching out saying they're living in the same conditions. Could I help them in the way that I had helped my family, by shaming their landlord into doing what is right? And again, in some cases, 10 years, 15 years, they had been living in disrepair. So that was what I decided to do for the last 3 years. I've been working with the likes of Good Morning Britain, BBC, ITV, had a Channel 4 documentary highlighting the conditions people are being forced to live in. And what we've learned is that 3 years ago, I was fighting a sector and trying to convince them that there's a problem here, and they were in denial and saying they're all isolated incidents, that it's not widespread. After 3 years of going around the country and proving actually it's across the country, and we're talking about millions of people living in disrepair or damp and mould. And we had Grenfell, we had the death of Al Bishak, and 6 years on we're still proving that people are living in conditions which can only be described as slum conditions because they are that bad and not fit for human beings to be living in. And now they're starting to take accountability, but obviously we've got a social housing sector where we haven't got enough homes. We've got 1.25 million people waiting on a social housing list, waiting to get into social housing. Then in the private rented accommodation, every 8 minutes a Section 21 eviction notice is handed to a family in England. So every 8 minutes a family is being evicted from their home. We've got a situation where the homes that we do have is of poor quality, or there's a lot of people that are overcrowded, or there's issues with damp and mould, long lists of disrepair. I've been in homes where I've been stood 2 inches deep in raw sewage, or raw sewage running down people's walls. The list is absolutely endless, and I think it comes back, there's a whole point here about the quality of the homes that we're building, because it's not just old homes that I've been into where it's fallen to bits. I've been to homes that were only constructed and built in 2018 that are falling to bits now. I'm talking balconies rotting on the verge of collapse, these homes with damp and mould, corroded pipes, disrepair, infestations, cockroaches, mice, you name it. And I've made the point that if we think we have a problem with social housing at the moment and we're just going to convince ourselves that it's just old stock, what's going to happen is we're going to construct these homes that we currently are of poor quality, and we're going to knock them up as quickly as possible in order to meet demand and not do a good job. And in 20 years' time, we're going to have an even bigger problem than we have now, where we have all these new builds that have been put up that don't even last 20 years and are to fall into bits. We're going to have to go and knock them back down to rebuild actual quality homes. And it's going to take a lot of money. We already know it's going to take a lot of money to try and meet the existing demand for social housing and housing in general in this country, because of the way in which housing has been neglected by consecutive governments over the last 60 years plus. I think it's fair to say. I think one of my bigger worries at the moment, long-term worries, is the issue of climate change and housing. And I think it's very much a growing issue that we are eventually going to have to address when it comes to housing. I mean, we all saw last year the fact during our summer we had record temperatures. We had hit 40 degrees in some places, and we saw what that had done to some homes burning down, for example, or in the winter when we have extreme weather, where we've got flooding in coastal areas and homes being destroyed. These are events that we're going to have to expect will happen more and more frequently as time goes on, especially if we don't address this issue of climate change. But what it means is there's going to be a lot of people displaced from their homes, and it means there's going to be a lot, I don't just mean domestically, I mean on an international level too. There's going to be countries affected by climate change, homes washed away, burnt down, and it's going to mean that we're going to see a lot more migration and people moving from country to country, island to country, different places, both domestically and internationally. And it's going to affect our homes, ultimately. Now, the question is, are we building our homes? Are we preparing for what we could potentially be seeing in the future? Currently, my own thoughts is no. I get complaints on a daily basis about the conditions people are living in. It's my job to go and shame landlords for that. But I'm seeing, especially during summers, a lot of people writing to me, last year in particular, that are worried about the conditions of their homes, not talking about disrepair, but the fact that their homes are overheating, the fact that when we have temperatures that are really, really hot, they are absolutely boiling in their homes, but then in contrast get complaints in winter where people are absolutely freezing in their homes. We've got issues like damp and mold, and it begs the question, are we preparing as quickly as possible to, especially in the next 10 to 15 years now, be constructing homes that takes climate change and the effects of climate change in mind, or are we going to be constructing these homes which in 10 to 15 years, 20 years from now is going to be unbearable for people to live in? So absolutely, we're having conversations about the need to build more homes, build quality homes, build homes that are disrepair free, build more temporary accommodation, build more social housing. But are we forgetting about the fact that homes also need to be built in mind for longevity, and the fact that in 20 years' time we could be seeing more and more extreme cases of extreme weather in both the summer and the winter? And are we preparing in building homes that is going to take that in mind and be able to counteract that as best as possible? So that's a bit about what I do, where I started, why I started, but also I think my concerns, climate change is one that perhaps isn't being addressed as much as it should be right now, but definitely something we need to start addressing, because it's going to be, I think when it comes to housing terms, the biggest issue we potentially could be facing. In terms of my sort of future goals and what I want to do sort of short term is push this agenda of housing, the quality of our homes, the need for more housing, more social housing at government level. Like I said, this is an issue and a subject that has been neglected by consecutive governments for 50, 60 plus years. I mean, I remember watching, I don't know if you've seen Kathy Come Home, a documentary from the 60s where people were going through similar to what I'm seeing on a daily basis at grassroots levels in terms of complaints from tenants, damp and mold, those sorts of disrepair issues, and it's been neglected by government. So I'm very much wanting, especially in the run-up to the next election, to get governments to prioritise housing once and for all. It's always something that's further down the list of priorities when it comes to general elections, or they prioritise the wrong things when it comes to housing, but I want them to really address the things that actually matter and are impacting people's lives on a daily basis. And I think we need more and more people calling for that at the next election. So that is my short-term goal, but also to continue applying pressure to local authorities, councils, developers, to make sure the homes that they are building are the right ones and not just being knocked up in order to meet targets or to make profits.
I think this is, oh my God, this is a loud one.
Yeah.
You should have had
like
this
it
one.
It has got louder, I think.
You should have
that.
That
That one is louder, yeah.
Oh, we made the wrong mic choice there.
Hopefully you guys could still hear in the back over there.
Do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and the depth and breadth of the work that you've been doing is unfathomable. I mean, put your hand up if you've seen Kwajo's face on TV, right? We are amongst a star. But there's a kind of a bittersweetness to that, because you were still studying when you started this, weren't you? You kind of completed your studies during this work that you did.
Yeah.
So there's a personal cost to you in taking this work on. I know you don't see it as a cost necessarily because you're so driven and connected to it. But it wasn't like you were going, sure, what'll I do next with my time? You had a load.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you've come through that. I just wanted to acknowledge that about the way that this weighs on you personally as well, so that people don't think it's grand, we've got Kwajo. Actually, we need to shore up your resource and your resilience. But the resilience thing was what I wanted to come back to a little bit, because you talked about the impact of climate change, both immediately through the extreme weather changes that we're seeing here, but also on as Indy talked about earlier on, when we talk about a movement of people, it's a very, very real thing. So I just wanted to ask you how you're seeing those impacts. Can we just go a little bit deeper into what you're seeing, and particularly when people talk about retrofit, yes, we're talking about making those homes resilient, but there's a very, very urgent need, isn't there? So you're obviously seeing the impacts of people's homes. Can you talk a little bit about what those experiences are like, and then also we could maybe lead into what promises, because you've been meeting with government as well, and what promises are coming through that do you see there's an urgency to any of those things? So maybe a little bit more about those, help people imagine the impacts of those extreme weather, climate situations that what we're seeing?
Well, in the worst cases, I mean, talking about last year where homes were actually burnt down during some of the hottest temperatures on record that we were having, and there was a point actually where it was only a few families that we could do it for, but we were giving out like fans to people living in high rises and blocks of flats that were at like the very top because their homes were so hot. I mean, unbearably hot during these temperatures. So you'd think, oh, it's 40 degrees. It was 40 degrees outside, and it felt way hotter in those homes, and people had kids. And I mean, we're talking about social housing here. We've got some extremely vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals living in these high rises, and they really were suffering during those temperatures. And that's when the penny dropped for me, because I thought this is going to be happening more and more frequently, and I don't think we've seen the worst. It's going to get worse as each year goes on if we don't tackle this issue of climate change. But then also during winters, when people's homes are being flooded, and the amount of leaks that we're seeing as a result of this, and we constantly switching on the news during winter and seeing, well, especially when there's storms, in people in coastal areas, their homes and basement homes being flooded and destroyed, and it's happening. It's not just happened once, it's happened over the last few years that they're saying the same things are happening, and those sorts of things are going to be happening more and more frequently. And to some, it's almost like, well, it's not happening to us, so it's fine. But what's going to happen? It's going to happen to more and more people, and I think that the impacts will be devastating. I mean, we're talking about people's health and safety in these cases, and during those extreme sort of weather patterns, especially here, that's when I noticed a lot more DMs and messages, not just asking me about disrepair, but the fact that they're boiling in their homes or they're freezing cold. And I know the government's speaking about insulating homes, and both Labour and Conservative want to have a push on that. But what about like during summers and peak temperatures then? Or what about the conditions and quality of our homes as years go on? What about the homes that are 60, 70, 80 years old and not built for what it is that we're seeing now in terms of climate? What are we going to do about that? It's going to be, I think, devastating long term if it's not addressed, and it's absolutely going to cost the government a lot too to address if they wait, like they have with a lot of issues when it comes to housing, for it to become a crisis before they deal with it. It's going to cost them a lot more long term, and that's definitely something I'm trying to push and put in front of them to consider, and now before it is a crisis for them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because what you've described through the case studies and what you've shown, and if anybody follows you on your social media, like, it's quite a lot to see a case study after a case study after. How many case studies do we need to prove that this is a crisis? And I think that urgency is really, really frustrating to see, exactly at what point. Like, how many case studies is enough case studies before we see that urgent action? So when you've been speaking to government, do you feel that that message is helping escalate action, real action that's tangible in the short and long term, or is it just more kicking the can down the road?
Well, I think I know at least that I've put it on the table, so I know they've heard concerns now, whether they just choose to deal with it or not. They've heard about it and it's been put in front of them. For me, I've met politicians regularly and spoken to them about issues with housing and disrepair, and there seems like there is concern there. But whether that translates to real, genuine solutions that's going to impact people's lives, like the everyday person's life for the better, I don't know. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see about that. Or will policies just be created in order to create a strategy that's going to win them an election and sound good to the ears of the everyday people, rather than creating real change. Yeah, real change.
I mean, I think that idea of like showing what's happening, and then the people that you're showing it to maybe I'm generalizing a bit, but can have the luxury to walk away and turn around and say, well, it's not my reality, and so it's not there all the time. It's a crying shame and a scandal, frankly, that it needs to be something that, to really resonate, should be happening to you. But like as you said, and to quote like Kay Tempest, the water level's rising, right? So, and I mean that in pressure terms and in everything else. Like this is, you can't kick this anymore down the line. It has to be dealt with more up front. I don't know how much time we have left, but I wonder if there are any questions from the audience for Kwajo. We've got one there and one there. And may I ask if there are any non-binary folk, women, who would like to also ask a question as well, just to also put that out there. So I'll come here, and then maybe we can encourage some more. Here you go.
Hi, Kwajo. We've been in email or social media contact actually in the past. But when you've addressed some of these problems, did you see a belligerence or an indifference on the social housing providers, or did you think it was a capacity or resource problem they were facing to try and resolve some of these problems?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, that is a very, very difficult question. I think in terms of resources for councils, that was a lot of the time, and I give both a very, very hard time, local authorities and housing associations. I think more so local authorities said it was a resource and funding sort of issue compared to some of the housing associations, especially the larger ones that I've work with, highlighted. I think, well, in the majority of cases, I'd say the situations get sorted. I mean, when you turn to social media and you highlight a case of someone living in disrepair, especially for 10 years, and you say, you're the housing provider, I've seen evidence that they've been communicating with you, you failed to do your job, basically. There is a response there, but in a lot of cases, what I see is that same response isn't there before I get involved. And that lack of care and urgency isn't there before I get involved. And we talk about funding and resources, and this is where I'm sort of critical and harsh with local authorities, because a big problem here, especially with the state people are living in, comes down to attitudes and lack of care. And fundamentally, that doesn't cost anything, I think, especially from members of staff. Having compassion, care, empathy for those living in social housing, and removing that stigma doesn't cost anything. And for me, that is the foundation of any or should be the foundation of any housing provider, is fundamentally to have that. Because if we flip this to the NHS, and there were situations where patients were being neglected in the same way that some of the cases I've been highlighting, or they didn't have the same lack of compassion for their patients or empathy, there would be absolutely outrage, I think. But what I see is the systemic problem is that lack of compassion and empathy and care when it comes to these certain individual situations. There's a lot of people that work in housing that just aren't able to connect with social housing tenants. You look at the boards of some of these housing associations, and you look across, and there's sort of no diversity, there's no class diversity. You ask them, have you lived in social housing? No. When last did you go onto a estate to visit social housing tenants? And I'm not speaking for all, but I'm talking especially about the big ones. There's a huge disconnect between those at the top and those that they're providing their service to, and I think that's where it fails. But absolutely, I mean, local authorities need more funding. They need more funding to build homes. They need more funding to continue functioning and making sure these situations aren't happening. But two, I do think there's a question there about the efficiency and money management within local authorities and housing associations, but I think the public sector too. But that's not an excuse. The answer is we need more funding from government and resources in order to make sure this sort of thing isn't happening. But again, attitudes and the way in which we're treating people costs absolutely nothing.
Thank you for that. I'm looking around. Do we have... Yeah, Melissa, I'll come to you. We'll have this last one, and then I think maybe... I don't know how tight the clock is, but let's come to you, Melissa.
So I've worked on a couple of retrofit projects for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which does work simply in the social housing sector. So I know there is a little bit of work being done there. I agree there's not nearly enough funding. So at the moment, it's just targeting certain of the worst off that can be organized well, right? So there's a lot of kind of input about how well can the project be project managed, you know, and how many can be done at one time and that sort of thing. So there's gonna be a lot of gaps in that. Yeah. But I'm even more worried about the fact that now that the stick has been taken away from private landlords, I think the number is something like 4.6 million private rentals in the UK. And something like 40% of those landlords don't have a single property with an EPC above a D. So we've got a huge problem with private rental, which, as you know, often has low income tenants as well. And there's nothing for them. There's at least a moral obligation on the part of the councils, but there's nothing addressing the private renter sector at all. I'd love to know if you know of anything different, or if you agree with me that it's just a huge gap.
I mean, we've got a problem, we have got a massive problem, a huge problem in social housing, and I've been sort of on the receiving end of that, but what's undeniable is the scale of problem within the private sector. Exactly with what you've explained, and so many other situations, like, for example, we've had the social housing bill, where the renters reform bill is, we have no clue at the moment, in terms of councils too and their sort of obligation. I think it's sort of, it's the current way it works is really flawed, because at the moment what government is expecting is for local authorities to be able to support themselves, but also be doing X, Y, and Z in the private rented sector too. When we know how stretched they are, we know what's happened to council budgets over the last 13 years and beyond, and it's going to be completely impossible for them to meet the scale of demand that is there at the moment. And it's sort of these big issues, I think, that fall on the doorstep of government that they need to address, because there's no, it's beyond a degree, or it's just sheer common sense. Like, we cannot be expecting councils that are already struggling to then go and work miracles in the private sector and do things that they can't. And what that means is that there's people in the private sector that are left to suffer and sort of ignored. But we have got a major issue in across the private sector, across housing and the rented sector in general, I think. But we have got far more homes, private rented accommodation, than we do social housing across the country. So we can expect a much bigger level of problem there. But it's absolutely true what you said. I don't think enough has been done or is being done in the private sector to address the same issues that we're seeing in social housing, but some of it, there's more of a spotlight on those issues when it comes to social housing, if that makes sense. So I completely agree.
I think, are we at the end of this session slot? What I would like to do is ask you if there are things that I mean, you're doing a lot of heavy lifting. So have you got a request or an ask of the audience in terms of how we can support what you do or support things similar to this, so we're not all going here? Like, it's all on your shoulders.
Yeah.
Is there an ask that you might have of us as a community of people?
Yeah, I think as individuals, I think the most important thing is to be able to have these conversations and continue these conversations and have these conversations with as many people as possible, because like the work that I do and the stigma that comes along with a lot of it, and it's the same sorts of things happen in the private rented sector in terms of conditions too. People feel often embarrassed or ashamed to openly have these conversations, especially if they're going through it. And I think what needs to happen is safe spaces created where we have dialogue and discussions without that stigma or judgment coming along, because that's the biggest fear for people going through it. I also think we need to be having more and more conversations about the real issues within housing, especially in the run-up to the election, and be able to sort of reflect on what it is that you're seeing and what it is that's being promised by governments, especially in relation to housing and their manifestos, because it will be coming out. Are they promising things that's genuinely going to impact the lives of everyday people that are really struggling, especially in rented accommodation at the moment? Or are they dangling a shiny carrot in front of our noses in order to win themselves an election? Ultimately, I think we need to be able to reflect on that and stand back and look and actually think, well, is this going to deal with the issues that we know are happening because it's impacting our lives and people that we know? Or is this another sort of facade that we're being promised? We need to be asking those questions of our politicians, the people that ultimately come round every 5 years begging for our votes, right? I think that's what I could ask from you guys, and yeah, just keep this conversation of housing at the top of not just your agenda, but pushing it to be the top of the agenda for our local politicians, for our government, and in the media too, because that's how we continue this conversation going. Housing's been neglected, like I said, for generations, longer than I've been alive, my mum's been alive, and it's about time it was treated with the sort of urgency that it needs. We cannot fix other social issues within society unless we fix housing, and a prime example is we can't fix healthcare, we cannot fix education. Look at crime, look at poverty. It all links back to housing and the ability to have a safe and decent home over our head. And until we get that right, how can we possibly expect to fix the other sort of issues within society too?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Round of applause for Kwajo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.